For the better part of a decade, it seemed the United States and Europe were on a shared path when it came to artificial intelligence. But that consensus has fractured. We're here to examine a significant analysis titled The Great Divergence, which documents the emerging transatlantic schism in AI governance and explores what this means for the future of technology. So here is our roadmap for this analysis. We'll begin by looking at how that old consensus fell apart. Then we'll dive into America's new, quite aggressive strategy and how Europe is being forced to respond. After that, we'll explore the deeper philosophical and even physical divide that's driving this conflict. And finally, we'll cover what this all means for global companies caught in the middle of a new compliance nightmare. So let's start with part one, the consensus collapses. As I mentioned, there was, for many years, a sense of a shared journey in AI governance between the US and Europe. But in 2025, that shared path effectively ceased to exist. Okay, let's break this down. The old model was pretty straightforward, right? You had the US innovating, building the tech, and the EU taking the lead on regulation. This was often called the Brussels effect, where European rules, by default, became the global standard. Now, that symbiotic relationship is gone. It's been replaced by an active conflict. The US has made a very deliberate pivot to deregulation, while the EU, facing its own internal crises, is being forced to defend and recalibrate its own approach. This brings us to our second section, America's Preemption Doctrine. Now, this is a fascinating and powerful new strategy. It's not just about the federal government choosing not to regulate AI, it's about the federal government actively using its power to stop individual states from creating their own rules. And this change in direction happened with remarkable speed. You see it here on the timeline. In January 2025, the previous administration's executive order on AI safety was revoked. Just a few months later, in July, a new plan focused entirely on competitiveness was put in its place. And then, the decisive move came in December, a new executive order that formally established this doctrine of federal preemption as the official policy of the United States. So what exactly is regulatory preemption? Well, it's a well-established legal tool. As the slide says, it's the principle that federal law can override state law. But what's truly novel here is the argument being made. The new policy argues that the federal government's decision not to regulate is, in itself, a form of regulation, a policy of inaction that preempts any state that tries to step into that void with its own rules. And to enforce this, a new AI litigation task force has been created within the Department of Justice. Its entire purpose is to sue states like California and Colorado, and it's using a three-part legal strategy. First, it argues that separate state laws create an undue burden on national commerce. Second, it makes that novel claim we just discussed, that federal inaction is the supreme law of the land. And third, it's advancing a really provocative argument that safety rules violate an AI's First Amendment rights by compelling its speech. This really gets to the ideological heart of the American strategy, something called the Truthful Outputs Doctrine. The logic goes like this. If an AI model is trained on real-world data, and that data contains historical biases, then the model's reflection of those biases is considered a truthful output. From this viewpoint, any state law that requires the AI to mitigate that bias is essentially forcing the AI to be untruthful. It reframes bias mitigation as a form of compelled censorship. And if the legal arguments don't work, there's also a very powerful financial tool being used. The administration is threatening to withhold over $42 billion in federal funding for broadband development, that's the BEAD program, from any state that insists on keeping what it deems onerous AI laws. This puts states in a very, very difficult position. Okay, let's now shift our focus across the Atlantic. Because while all of this is happening in the US, the European Union finds itself on the defensive. It's being forced to recalibrate its entire digital strategy, partly because of an internal economic crisis, and partly because of this new, intense pressure from America. A real wake-up call for Brussels came from the 2024 Draghi report on European competitiveness. The quote you see here really says it all. The report's diagnosis was blunt. Europe was losing the global innovation race with the US and China. And a primary cause was its own complex web of regulations, the very Brussels effect it had once championed. The EU's answer to this crisis is a new legislative package called the Digital Omnibus proposal. Now, it's not a full repeal of their rules, but it is a significant watering down. As you can see, it does three crucial things. First, it pushes back the tough enforcement deadlines for the AI Act all the way to late 2027. Second, it creates a new, more lightly regulated category for small mid-caps to help European tech companies grow. And third, and this is a big one, it amends the GDPR to finally give a clear legal basis for using personal data to train AI models. But this internal policy shift is also happening under the threat of a trade war. The U.S. has issued a very direct ultimatum. It will only consider lowering tariffs on European steel and aluminum if the EU agrees to weaken its landmark digital regulations, the DMA and the DSA, which are aimed at reining in big tech. It's a move that EU officials have been quoted as calling blackmail. To really grasp why this is happening, we have to look beyond just policy papers and trade disputes. What we're witnessing is a collision. It's a collision of fundamentally different worldviews, and just as importantly, it's a collision of very different physical realities. This slide really gets to the core of the philosophical conflict. In the European Union, AI safety is fundamentally about protecting human rights. The ultimate goal is fairness. So if an AI's output reflects a biased reality, the AI itself must be corrected to produce a fair outcome. In the United States, under this new doctrine, AI safety is about producing truthful outputs. The goal is objectivity, even if that objective truth reflects historical inequalities. These are two completely opposing goals. You can't program a single AI model to do both at the same time. And this philosophical split is being reinforced by a very real physical divide: energy. AI is incredibly energy intensive. The United States is pursuing a policy of energy dominance, actively fast-tracking permits for the massive data centers and nuclear power plants that AI requires. The EU, on the other hand, is operating under an energy constraint. High energy costs and its own Green Deal commitments are severely limiting its ability to build out AI infrastructure at a comparable scale. So what does this all mean on a practical level? Well, that brings us to our final section, navigating what the analysis calls the compliance splinter net. This is the new, fragmented, and often contradictory reality for any technology company that wants to operate on both sides of the Atlantic. This compliance matrix for the year 2026 really lays out the impossible situation companies now face. Just look at that very first row, bias mitigation. In the United States, it is effectively prohibited. In the European Union, it's mandatory. It is simply not possible to build a single AI system that can comply with both of those rules simultaneously. The two regulatory regimes are in direct and irreconcilable opposition. So how are corporations expected to respond? Well, an entirely new playbook is emerging for 2026. Companies will have to engage in what's called technical forking, which means creating entirely separate AI models, US weights and EU weights. They'll need to build systems that literally swap an AI's core behavior based on a user's IP address. A likely strategy will be to train the power-hungry foundation models in the energy-rich United States and then deploy and fine-tune them for the EU market, all while restructuring their European business to qualify for that new regulatory relief. And so, this great divergence leaves us with a rather profound and unsettling question. When the world's two most powerful democratic blocs define a concept as fundamental as truth in completely different ways, whose version will our machines ultimately learn to speak? The answer to that question will shape not just the future of technology, but the very nature of our shared reality.